Get your hands up. Now. The sharp, commanding voice sliced through the air like a blade. The man froze, his hands instinctively rising as flashing red and blue lights painted his face. The night outside the convenience store was thick with tension, but nothing felt heavier than the pair of eyes locked onto him, eyes full of disdain. He stood near the counter, his wallet still open from paying for a pack of gum and a bottle of water. The cashier had barely handed him his receipt when the officer stormed inside, gun drawn, his finger trembling slightly on the trigger. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with confusion. "Shut up," the officer barked. "I said hands up. Don't move a damn muscle." People in the store froze. The cashier took a step back. The officer's voice carried the weight of authority, but there was something else beneath it, something venomous. "Step away from the counter," the officer ordered. "Now." He hesitated, his eyes darting between the gun and the officer's clenched jaw. "Do it." He complied, stepping back slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "What did I do?" he asked, his voice steadied despite the growing lump in his throat. The officer's lip curled. "Don't play dumb. You look suspicious as hell walking around here like you own the place. I got a report about a robbery suspect matching your description, tall, black, and cocky enough to think he can get away with it." The words hit like a slap. "Robbery? Are you kidding me? Don't talk back." The officer stepped closer, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Where's your ID?" "It's in my pocket," he said slowly. "I'm reaching for it, don't move." The officer lunged, grabbing his arm and slamming him against the counter. His wallet fell to the floor, the FBI badge inside it glinting briefly before flipping shut. But the officer didn't notice. The shove was hard enough to make the breath leave his lungs. His cheek pressed against the cold glass of the counter. "Don't resist me," the officer hissed, yanking his arm behind his back. "I'm not resisting." But the officer wasn't listening. "What's the matter?" The officer leaned closer, his breath hot with hostility. "Not so tough now, huh? Thought you could walk in here and take whatever you wanted? That's not what happened, shut up." The pressure increased. His shoulder screamed in protest, but he clenched his jaw. The store had gone silent except for the sound of the officer's radio crackling. "You're making a mistake," he said through gritted teeth. "The only mistake," the officer sneered, "was thinking you could walk into my neighborhood and not get caught." A flash of anger cut through the humiliation. He'd seen this before, felt it before. The assumptions. The power trips. The prejudice. But tonight, it felt heavier. "Look closer at my wallet," he said, his voice low but sharp. "What did you say?" "My wallet." The officer paused but didn't release him. Instead, he reached down, snatching the wallet off the floor and flipping it open. At first, there was silence. Then a shift. The officer's breath hitched. The badge stared back at him, shiny, unmistakable. "FBI." "You're lying," the officer muttered, but his grip loosened. "No," he said, straightening as the officer stumbled back. "I'm not." But the moment of recognition didn't bring relief. It brought something darker. The officer's eyes flicked to the badge, then back to his face. Fear crept into his expression, but it was quickly masked by anger. "Don't think this changes anything," the officer snapped. "Oh, it changes everything," he said, his voice steady now. But even as he spoke, he knew this wasn't over. The humiliation, the anger, the weight of years of injustice, it had all led to this moment. And the aftermath was going to be explosive. Because what happened next would leave the officer, and everyone else, absolutely stunned. How does a man who hides behind a badge face the truth when it's turned against him? And what happens when justice comes not from the law but from the man he tried to destroy? Stay tuned to find out. Hey there. Before we dive into today's story, we at Plow of Twist want to take a moment to say something important. We firmly stand against racism and discrimination in any form. This channel is a space for impactful storytelling that sheds light on real struggles, promotes justice, and empowers voices that need to be heard. If you've ever faced prejudice, know that you are seen, valued, and supported here. This story is dedicated to you and everyone who believes in fairness and equality. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for an emotional roller coaster. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you enjoy the story. Let's get started. The convenience store hummed faintly with the sound of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It was one of those small corner stores, wedged between a laundromat and a rundown barber shop with a faded red and white striped pole that hadn't spun in years. The cracked tile floors and dusty shelves spoke to years of wear and tear, but the place had a kind of tired familiarity, like it had been frozen in time. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution and microwaved burritos. Darius Cole stood near the counter, drumming his fingers lightly against a plastic bottle of water as he waited for the cashier to count out his change. He was tall, 6'2" with broad shoulders, and carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of knowing exactly who he was and where he stood. His dark brown skin contrasted sharply against the navy blue button-up shirt he wore, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing lean but defined forearms. He had one of those faces that demanded attention, sharp jawline, deep-set eyes, and a slight furrow in his brow that made him look perpetually thoughtful, even when he wasn't. But tonight, his expression was calm, almost distracted, as he glanced at his phone and slid it back into his pocket. Darius had grown up just a few blocks away from this very store. The neighborhood wasn't the best, it never had been, but it had character. He could still remember riding his bike down these streets as a kid, weaving between potholes and broken glass. Back then, the world had felt bigger, full of possibility. But things had changed. Buildings had decayed. Families had moved out. And the ones who stayed behind had learned to survive in ways that hardened them. Despite that, Darius had made it out. He went to college, joined the military, and eventually became an agent with the FBI. He'd worked hard for everything he had, refusing to let the world define him by the color of his skin or the zip code he grew up in. But even after everything he'd accomplished, there were moments like tonight, when the weight of other people's assumptions still pressed down on him. The cashier, a wiry teenager with acne and chipped fingernails, slid Darius's change across the counter without meeting his eyes. "Have a good night," Darius said, his voice even but polite. The kid muttered something under his breath and turned away. Darius was used to it. He stuffed the change into his wallet and turned toward the door, only to stop short when he saw the police car pulling up outside. The lights weren't on, but something about the way it eased to a stop made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Officer Bradley Hart stepped out of the car, his posture rigid and purposeful. He was a stocky man with short-cropped blonde hair and pale skin that seemed to flush red too easily. The kind of man who always looked like he was on the verge of yelling, even when he wasn't. Bradley had been a cop in this neighborhood for over a decade, but not because he cared about the community. He liked the power. He liked the fear. And most of all, he liked making people like Darius feel small. Darius had encountered men like him before, men who wore their badges like armor and treated it as a license to dominate. But he'd never crossed paths with Bradley directly. Not until now. Bradley's eyes locked onto Darius the moment he stepped inside. "Hey. You." Darius paused, his hand still on the door handle. "Yeah, you," Bradley said, pointing. "Step away from the door." Darius turned slowly. "Is there a problem?" "You tell me," Bradley shot back, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you're in a hurry to leave." Darius raised an eyebrow. "I bought a bottle of water and some gum." "That's hardly suspicious." Bradley's jaw tightened. "Hands where I can see them." The tension in the store thickened. Darius glanced around. The cashier was staring, wide-eyed. A woman near the refrigerators froze, clutching a gallon of milk like it might shield her. Darius slowly raised his hands. Seriously? Don't talk, Bradley snapped. Just step away from the counter. Darius swallowed the retort burning on his tongue. He'd dealt with this before. He knew how it worked. Calm. Steady. Non-threatening. That's what they always said. But something about Bradley's tone, the look in his eyes, made Darius's blood heat. Look, Darius said, carefully. I'm reaching for my wallet to show you my ID. That's all. Don't move. Bradley barked, stepping closer. Darius froze. On your knees, Bradley ordered. Excuse me. You heard me. On your knees. Now. Darius's heart pounded. The humiliation clawed at him, but he bit it back. This isn't necessary. You think you get to decide what's necessary? Bradley sneered. Darius clenched his jaw. Get down. Bradley shouted. And then, without warning, Bradley shoved him. The impact sent Darius stumbling against the counter, knocking over a display of candy bars. His wallet fell, landing with a soft thud. Bradley grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. You think you're tough, huh? Bradley hissed. Get off me. Darius snapped, trying to twist free. But Bradley was stronger, or maybe just more determined. You don't belong here, Bradley growled. Darius saw red. Not belong. After everything he'd been through? After everything he'd earned? The anger flared hot, but then something shifted. Darius felt it in the room, like the air had changed. Bradley's grip loosened, just for a second. And that's when Darius spoke. You might want to check that wallet you just knocked out of my hands, he said. Bradley hesitated. What? My wallet, Darius repeated, his voice sharp and clear. Pick it up. Bradley did. And the moment his eyes landed on the FBI badge, the color drained from his face. For the first time all night, Bradley looked uncertain. But what happened after that? That's what no one saw coming. Because Bradley Hart's world was about to come crashing down. And by the time it was over, he wouldn't just be humiliated, he'd be unrecognizable. Bradley Hart's fingers trembled as he clutched the wallet. The shiny gold emblem of the FBI glared back at him like a spotlight exposing his worst fear. He'd just attacked a federal agent. His eyes darted up to Darius, whose gaze was locked on him with a piercing intensity that made Bradley's stomach twist. Is this some kind of joke? Bradley barked, though his voice cracked, betraying the panic clawing at his chest. Darius didn't flinch. He stood straighter now, shoulders squared, and took a slow step closer. Do I look like I'm joking? Bradley's eyes flickered to the cashier, then back to Darius. His grip on the wallet tightened as if he could crush the evidence in his palm and make it disappear. You assaulted me, Darius said, his voice low but sharp. You put your hands on me, humiliated me, and made it clear you think people like me don't belong here. So go ahead, say it's a joke. Watch your tone, Bradley snapped, his voice louder now, trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. You're not in control here. Darius's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, cold, knowing. Aren't I? Bradley's jaw clenched, and for a long moment, neither man moved. The tension hung so thick in the air it felt like it might snap. Then Bradley turned, walking quickly toward the door. Where do you think you're going? Darius's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. Bradley froze but didn't turn around. You think you can walk out of here and pretend this didn't happen? Darius continued, taking a deliberate step closer. That you can sweep this under the rug like everything else you've done in this neighborhood? Bradley finally turned, his face pale but defiant. You have no idea who you're messing with, he said through gritted teeth. No, Darius shot back. You have no idea who you just messed with. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Bradley's nostrils flared as he stuffed the wallet back into Darius's hands. This isn't over, Bradley spat, his voice shaking as he shoved past Darius and stormed out of the store. But Darius didn't move. He stood rooted in place, the adrenaline still pulsing through his veins. He knew men like Bradley didn't back down easily. If anything, this confrontation had probably lit a fire under him. And that was the part that worried Darius. The next morning, Darius sat in his car outside the FBI field office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The confrontation replayed in his mind on a loop, the look in Bradley's eyes, the way his voice had cracked, the venom in his words. Darius had dealt with racists before, but Bradley wasn't just a bigot with a badge. He was dangerous, and something about last night felt unfinished. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his boss, Special Agent Mitchell Gray. Agent Cole, Gray's voice boomed through the speaker when Darius answered. Got a minute? Sure, Darius replied, masking the unease simmering beneath his calm exterior. Come up to my office. We need to talk. Darius stepped into Gray's office, closing the door behind him. Gray was an older man, gray hair, sharp suit, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect. Sit down, Gray said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Darius obeyed. Gray leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. I got a call this morning, he began. From the local police department. Darius's stomach dropped, but he didn't let it show. They said one of their officers had an incident with you last night. Officer Bradley Hart. Darius held Gray's gaze. That's one way to describe it. Is it true? Gray asked. Did he physically assault you? Yes, Darius said without hesitation. Gray exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. Do you want to press charges? The question hung in the air. Darius knew what it meant, what it would mean for Bradley, but also for himself. Pressing charges meant opening an investigation, making headlines, and painting a target on his back. But not pressing charges. That meant letting Bradley walk away without consequences. I don't know yet, Darius admitted. Gray nodded. Take your time, but be smart about this, he said. You've got a career to protect. Darius's jaw tightened. I'm aware. By the time Darius left the office, his phone was vibrating again. This time, it was a blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. Cole. The line crackled. You think you're untouchable? The voice was low and sharp, but Darius recognized it immediately. Bradley. You calling to apologize? Darius asked, his voice calm but firm. I'm calling to warn you, Bradley hissed. You don't know what you're walking into. I know enough. No, you don't, Bradley snapped. You don't know who's backing me. You think I'm the only one who sees through you? Darius's heart pounded, but he refused to let it show. Are you threatening me? Bradley laughed, a short, cruel sound. You'll find out soon enough. The line went dead. Darius stared at the phone, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. That night, Darius sat in his apartment, the city lights flickering through the blinds. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that Bradley's words weren't just empty threats. There was something about the way he'd said them, like he knew something Darius didn't. But Darius wasn't the kind of man to back down. He'd spent his whole life fighting against people like Bradley, and he wasn't about to stop now. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being watched. When he stepped out onto his balcony, he saw it, a dark figure leaning against a car across the street. Bradley. And in that moment, Darius knew. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night air hung heavy, pressing down like a weight on Darius's chest as he sat in his car, parked just outside the police station. The hum of the engine had long since died, leaving only the faint crackle of the streetlights overhead and the distant sound of passing cars. His hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, knuckles pale from the force of his grip. Across the street, the station loomed, its windows glowing dimly like watchful eyes. The building was old, cracked bricks and fading paint giving it an almost haunted look. But Darius knew better. The ghosts weren't in the walls. They were inside, wearing uniforms and badges, pretending to be heroes. His heart pounded steadily, a rhythm he had trained himself to control. But tonight, it felt harder to steady. He checked the clock. 10:47 p.m. It was late, and the station was quieter now, fewer officers coming and going. Most of them had clocked out hours ago, but not Bradley. Darius knew he'd be inside, probably at his desk, leaning back in his chair with that smug expression he always seemed to wear. The same expression he'd worn when he shoved Darius against the counter just days earlier. Darius clenched his jaw, forcing the memory back. That moment had passed, but the sting of humiliation hadn't faded. He hadn't forgotten the way Bradley looked at him, like he didn't belong, like he was nothing. But tonight, that was going to change. The front doors swung open, and there he was, Bradley Hart. Darius's eyes locked onto him instantly. Bradley was out of uniform, wearing jeans and a leather jacket that looked a little too polished, like he was trying to compensate for something. He walked with the same cocky stride, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the street as if he owned it. But there was a stiffness in his movements, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Darius stepped out of his car, closing the door with deliberate force. The sound echoed, sharp and sudden, making Bradley's head snap toward him. Their eyes met, and for just a moment, Bradley faltered. It was quick, but Darius caught it, that flicker of doubt. Good. Bradley recovered fast, squaring his shoulders and stepping forward like he was marching onto a battlefield. What the hell do you think you're doing here? Bradley's voice cut through the night like a blade, sharp and demanding. Darius didn't flinch. He walked forward, calm and steady, his eyes never leaving Bradley's. We need to talk. Bradley snorted, but Darius didn't miss the way his hands twitched, nervous energy bubbling just below the surface. Oh, now you want to talk? Bradley sneered. You had plenty of time to talk back at the store, but you didn't. Darius stopped just a few feet away, his voice even. No, you didn't give me time to talk. But I'm here now. Bradley's smirk didn't reach his eyes. You don't scare me, he said, but there was an edge to his voice, like he was trying to convince himself. Darius tilted his head slightly, his expression hardening. I'm not here to scare you, Darius said. I'm here to finish this. Bradley's smirk dropped, his face hardening as his shoulders tensed. Finish what? You don't have anything on me. Darius reached into his coat pocket. Bradley flinched, his body tensing like he was ready for a fight. Relax, Darius said, pulling out a small flash drive and holding it up between his fingers. You might want to see this. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. What the hell is that? Darius took another step closer, his voice low but firm. Proof. Bradley's smirk returned, but it didn't hide the beads of sweat forming at his hairline. Of what? Darius leaned in just enough to make Bradley step back. Of everything you've done, Darius said. Illegal searches. False arrests. Planted evidence. All of it. I've got records, reports, and witness statements. And do you know what the best part is? Bradley's face reddened, but he said nothing. It's all admissible in court. You're bluffing, Bradley hissed, but his voice cracked. Darius's lips twitched, just enough to let Bradley know he wasn't. You think your badge protects you? Darius said. Think again. You're done. Bradley lunged, grabbing Darius by the collar, his face inches away. You think flashing that badge makes you untouchable? Bradley spat. No, Darius said calmly. But it makes me accountable. That's what separates us. Bradley's grip tightened, his knuckles white. You're gonna regret this. No, Darius said, staring him down. You are. Before Bradley could react, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. Bradley froze, his hands dropping as he turned to see two unmarked FBI vehicles pulling up. The doors opened, and agents stepped out, their faces cold and unreadable. Bradley took a step back. What is this? Special Agent Mitchell Gray stepped forward, his voice sharp and steady. It's over, Hart. Bradley stumbled, his face pale. You don't know what you're doing. We know exactly what we're doing, Gray said. You're under investigation, Bradley. You've been under investigation for weeks. And tonight, you just added assaulting a federal agent to your list of charges. Bradley's panic turned to anger as he turned to Darius. You did this. No, Darius said, stepping closer. You did this to yourself. Bradley turned to run, but two agents grabbed him, forcing his arms behind his back. You can't do this. Bradley shouted. You can't take me down. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the street. You're finished, Gray said as Bradley was led toward the car. Darius stood silently, watching as Bradley was shoved into the back seat. For the first time, the man who had tried so hard to assert his power looked small, broken. Gray turned to Darius. You okay? Darius nodded, though his heart still pounded. It's not over, Gray said. Darius glanced at the flash drive still in his hand. No, he said. Not yet. And as the car disappeared down the street, Darius knew the fallout from this wouldn't end here. The storm was coming. And he was ready for it. Bradley sat in the back of the FBI vehicle, his wrists locked in cuffs that felt heavier with every passing second. The leather jacket he'd worn so confidently earlier now felt suffocating, sticking to his skin as sweat beaded along his temples. He stared out the window, his mind racing as the city lights blurred past. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not after all the years he'd spent building his reputation, controlling this neighborhood, keeping everyone in check. And yet, here he was. You don't have to do this, Bradley finally said, his voice strained as he leaned toward the partition separating him from the agents in the front seat. We can talk about this. Come on, let's talk. The agents ignored him. Hey, he snapped, pounding his cuffed hands against the glass. I said let's talk. Still, no response. Bradley slumped back against the seat, his chest heaving. He tried to steady his breathing, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Darius's face. Calm. Unshaken. Like he'd known this would happen all along. The car slowed, then turned sharply. Bradley's stomach twisted. He looked up just in time to see the glowing lights of the FBI field office ahead. No, 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 he muttered under his breath. The car stopped. The back door opened, and Bradley was yanked out by two agents who barely looked at him. Careful, Bradley barked. I've got rights, you know. The agent gripping his arm didn't even flinch. You should have thought about that before you threw them away. They led him through the building's dimly lit hallways, each step echoing loudly, like a drumbeat counting down to something he wasn't ready to face. Doors slammed shut behind him as he was marched deeper inside until finally, they stopped in front of an interrogation room. The door creaked open, and Bradley was shoved inside. The room was small, plain gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a single chair waiting for him under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Bradley's reflection stared back at him from the one-way mirror, pale and panicked. Sit, one of the agents ordered. Bradley hesitated, but the shove between his shoulder blades made the decision for him. He dropped into the chair, the cuffs clinking loudly against the metal table. The door closed behind him. He was alone. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Bradley couldn't tell anymore. The weight of the cuffs dug into his wrists, and every sound, the hum of the lights, the faint murmur of voices outside, felt like it was closing in on him. Then the door opened again. And there he was. Darius Cole. Bradley's body tensed. Darius stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't even move to the table. Instead, he stood there, arms crossed, staring down at Bradley like he was seeing right through him. "What the hell is this?" Bradley snapped, trying to sound defiant, but his voice wavered. Darius didn't answer. You said enough," Darius cut him off, his voice low and controlled, but sharp enough to slice through the tension. Bradley swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You have no idea what you're doing," Bradley spat. "You think you're saving this neighborhood? Protecting it? You don't get it. You never did." Darius's eyes narrowed. "No, you don't get it," Darius shot back. "You've spent years terrorizing the people in this community, bullying them, humiliating them, treating them like criminals before they even had a chance. And you think that badge gives you the right to do it? I was doing my job." Bradley snapped. "Your job?" Darius repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "Your job was to protect and serve. Instead, you turned this neighborhood into your personal playground, because you thought no one would stand up to you." Bradley leaned forward, the cuffs rattling as he slammed his hands on the table. "I kept order." Darius stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No. You kept people afraid." Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but Darius wasn't finished. "You want to talk about order? Let's talk about the dozens of complaints filed against you, the ones that mysteriously disappeared. Let's talk about the false reports, the intimidation tactics, the people you locked up without cause just because you didn't like the way they looked at you." Bradley's face flushed red, but he didn't speak. "You didn't keep order, Bradley," Darius said. "You kept chaos, and you hid behind your badge while you did it." Bradley's breathing grew heavier. "You don't know what it's like," Bradley hissed. "To be out there every day, surrounded by people who hate you. People who'd kill you just for wearing the uniform. You think it's easy. You think it's black and white. It's not. It's survival." "Survival?" Darius's voice was deadly calm. "You think that's what this was? Survival?" "Yes." Bradley snapped. "You think you're better than me, but you're not. You'll see. This job, it changes you." "No," Darius said quietly. "It reveals you." Bradley froze. Darius leaned down, his hands flat on the table. "And now everyone's going to see exactly who you are." The words hung in the air like a bomb about to go off. Bradley's eyes darted toward the mirror, knowing there were people on the other side watching, listening. "You think they'll believe you?" Bradley whispered, desperation creeping into his voice. "They already do," Darius said. The door opened again. This time, it was Gray. "It's time," Gray said. Darius stepped back, and Bradley's chair scraped loudly as he stood, his face pale. "You can't do this," Bradley said, his voice shaking now. "You can't destroy me like this." Darius stepped aside as the agents moved in. "You already destroyed yourself," Darius said softly. And with that, Bradley was escorted out, his shouts echoing down the hall as Darius stood in the quiet, the weight of the moment settling over him. He'd won this battle. But he knew this wasn't over, not yet. The hallway outside the interrogation room was suffocatingly quiet. Darius leaned against the cold wall, his arms crossed as he watched the agents lead Bradley further down the corridor. The sound of Bradley's footsteps, heavy and reluctant, echoed until it faded into the distance. Even then, Darius didn't move. His mind was a storm, sharp flashes of adrenaline still pulsing through him, but beneath it, there was something else. Something heavier. Relief? Maybe. But it wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. Mitchell Gray stepped up beside him, his expression unreadable. "You did good in there," Gray said quietly. Darius didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the floor, jaw tight. "You don't have to carry this alone, Cole," Gray added. "You need to remember that." Darius exhaled sharply through his nose and finally looked up. "It doesn't feel like it's over." Gray's brow furrowed. "It's not," Darius admitted. "You know that as well as I do." Gray nodded slowly. "Men like him don't just disappear quietly," Darius continued. "He's got friends. Connections. People who think like he does, people who let him get away with this for years. Bradley was never working alone. And we'll deal with that," Gray said firmly. "One step at a time." Darius shook his head. "We don't have time for steps," he said. "This department is broken. We can't pretend like cutting off one head fixes the snake." Gray studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the nearby office. "Come on," he said. "Let's talk." Inside the office, Gray closed the door behind them and sat across from Darius. "I know how you feel," Gray started. "No, you don't," Darius cut in. Gray held his gaze. "I know what it's like to want justice so bad that it keeps you up at night," Gray said evenly. "I know what it's like to see the rot from the inside and feel powerless to stop it. And I know what it's like to think one win isn't enough." Darius looked away. "But you also need to know when to breathe," Gray continued. "Because if you let this eat at you, it'll tear you apart." Darius leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I can't just walk away from this," he said. "Not after everything I saw tonight. You saw how he looked at me, even in cuffs. He doesn't think this is over. And honestly, neither do I." Gray was quiet for a moment, then leaned back. "You're right," he said. "It's not over. But that doesn't mean you're in this alone. We've got evidence. Witnesses. And Bradley isn't the only one we're looking at. There's more coming. And I need you here for it. Clear-headed." Darius clenched his jaw. Clear-headed doesn't change the fact that people like him keep coming back. That system keeps protecting them. "Not this time," Gray said. "How can you be so sure?" Darius asked, his voice sharp. "Because we're not letting this go," Gray replied. "And neither are you." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Darius let them sink in. It wasn't over, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Later that night, Darius sat in his apartment, the glow from his laptop illuminating the room. The screen was filled with reports, files, and case notes, documents linked to Bradley and others like him. Patterns emerged as he pieced the information together. Complaints dismissed. Evidence tampered with. Reports rewritten. It wasn't just Bradley. It never had been. Darius's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Cole." A pause. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Bradley's voice. Low, sharp, but frayed at the edges. "You're calling me from jail?" Darius asked, his tone flat. "Don't get too comfortable," Bradley hissed. "You think this is the end? You think you've won?" "No," Darius said, leaning back. "I think this is the beginning." Bradley's laugh was cold and bitter. "You have no idea what's coming." Darius didn't flinch. "I know exactly what's coming," he said. "Accountability. For you. For everyone like you." Bradley's breathing quickened. "You're playing a dangerous game," Bradley snapped. "You really think you can clean up this mess?" You don't know half of it. Then I'll learn, Darius said. You'll never stop us, Bradley spat. You'll never stop me. Darius leaned forward, his voice sharp. I already did. The line went dead. Darius stared at the phone for a long time before setting it down. 2 days later, the investigation widened. More officers were implicated, names Darius recognized, faces he'd seen in passing, men who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with Bradley and looked the other way. The department was in chaos, scrambling to contain the fallout. Protests broke out in front of the station. Reporters flooded the streets. And through it all, Darius remained focused. He stood at his desk, surrounded by stacks of files, when Gray approached. You were right, Gray said. Darius looked up. About what? This wasn't just about Bradley, Gray said, dropping another folder on the desk. It's bigger. And it's messier. Darius opened the folder and felt his stomach tighten. Photos. Reports. Names. This isn't just a few bad apples, Gray continued. It's the whole damn tree. Darius exhaled slowly. Then we burn it down, he said. Gray smirked. Careful, he said. I think you're starting to sound like me. Darius closed the folder and met Gray's gaze. No, he said. I'm starting to sound like me. And as he looked back at the files, he knew one thing for certain, this wasn't just about taking down one man. This was about rebuilding something better. But first, he had to finish what he started. The fluorescent lights in the holding room buzzed faintly, casting sharp shadows along the walls. Darius stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor as the heavy steel door shut behind him with a dull, final clang. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal, but it was the tension in the air that made it feel suffocating. Bradley sat slouched at the table, his wrists cuffed and resting on the scratched surface. He looked smaller now, his once cocky posture reduced to a hunched, tired frame. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with shadows, snapped up the moment Darius entered. So they sent you, Bradley muttered, leaning back in his chair with forced defiance. Darius didn't respond right away. He pulled out the chair across from Bradley and sat down slowly, his movements deliberate. He placed a file on the table but didn't open it. Instead, he studied Bradley, letting the silence stretch. I asked to come, Darius said finally, his voice calm but edged. Bradley let out a sharp laugh, though it cracked halfway through. Of course you did, he said bitterly. You couldn't wait to rub it in, could you? Big hero gets to look down on the guy in cuffs. Darius's expression didn't change. Save it, Darius said, his voice steady. I'm not here to gloat. Bradley leaned forward, his cuffs clinking against the table. Then why are you here? Darius stared at him. Because this doesn't end with you. Bradley froze, but only for a second. Then he leaned back again, trying to force a smirk that didn't quite land. You don't get it, Bradley said, shaking his head. You think you've won something, don't you? Like this is over now. It's not over, Darius said sharply. We both know that. Bradley's eyes flickered, his smirk slipping further. Good, Bradley said, his voice dropping. Because it's not. Not even close. Then start talking, Darius said, leaning closer. Tell me who's pulling the strings. Bradley hesitated, his shoulders tensing. You don't want to know, Bradley muttered. Yes, I do, Darius shot back. Bradley's eyes locked onto his. No, Bradley said, his voice shaking slightly. You really don't. Darius's jaw tightened. Stop playing games, he said, his tone sharp. You're out of options, Bradley. You want to walk out of this alive? You start talking. Bradley's breath quickened, and for the first time, Darius saw something raw in his expression, fear. Real fear. They'll kill me, Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not if you help us stop them, Darius replied. Bradley shook his head. You don't know what you're dealing with, Bradley hissed. These people, they're not just cops. They're everywhere. Judges, politicians, businessmen. You think I was bad? Bradley's voice broke. Green's worse. Patrick Green, he's the one you want. But he's not alone. Darius's stomach tightened. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of cold through him. Keep talking, Darius said. Bradley leaned forward. Green runs it, Bradley said. The whole operation, planting evidence, manipulating reports, covering up anything that could stick. And the worst part? Half the people in this department know about it. Hell, some of them helped him build it. Darius's pulse pounded in his ears. Names, Darius said firmly. I need names. Bradley hesitated again, his breathing ragged. Green, Bradley said. And Clark. But it doesn't stop with them. They've got people outside the department, too, lawyers, city officials. It's a network. And if you think taking me down scared them, you're wrong. It just made them angry. Darius leaned closer. So give me the proof. Bradley swallowed hard. I can't, Bradley said. Not yet. Darius's patience snapped. Don't play with me, Bradley, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. You don't get to act like you're calling the shots anymore. Bradley flinched but didn't back down. You think I don't want to give you what you need? Bradley hissed. You think I want to be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life? They'll come for me first. And if you keep pushing, they'll come for you too. Darius stared at him, unblinking. Let them try, Darius said, his voice low. But I'm not letting this go. Bradley shook his head. You don't get it, Bradley said. You think you're fighting one enemy, but this is bigger than you. Bigger than me. These people don't just destroy lives, they erase them. Darius leaned back, letting Bradley's words settle in the air. Then we make sure they can't erase this, Darius said. Bradley's shoulders sagged. You better be ready, Bradley muttered. Because once this starts, there's no stopping it. Darius stood up, his eyes locked on Bradley. I'm ready, Darius said. Bradley didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said enough. He believed Darius. And that terrified him. As Darius walked out of the room, the door shutting heavily behind him, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just about taking down Green or even the network behind him. It was about rebuilding trust in a system that had failed too many people for too long. Gray was waiting for him in the hall, his arms crossed. Well? Gray asked. We've got names, Darius said. Gray's eyebrows lifted. Green. And others, Darius confirmed. But this isn't just a case anymore. It's a war. Gray nodded slowly. Then let's make sure we win it. Darius nodded, already feeling the weight of what came next. There was no turning back now. Darius stood in the dimly lit FBI briefing room, the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The walls were lined with corkboards covered in pinned photos, maps, and strings connecting names that had surfaced in the investigation. The faces of officers, judges, and businessmen stared back at him, their images captured in still frames that couldn't fully capture the weight of what they represented. Mitchell Gray entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. He carried another folder, his expression hard, the kind of look that came from years of dealing with messes that didn't have easy solutions. He dropped the folder onto the table, his voice steady but low. It's worse than we thought. Darius didn't look up right away. His eyes stayed fixed on one of the photos, Patrick Green. The man's face was sharp, angular, with eyes that seemed to cut straight through the camera. How much worse? Darius finally asked, his voice flat but controlled. Gray flipped open the folder and pushed it toward Darius. "They're on to us," Gray said. "Green's already started covering his tracks. He's pulling files, destroying evidence, and a couple of our sources just went silent. I don't think it's a coincidence." Darius's jaw tightened. "They're scared," Gray continued, watching Darius closely. "Which means they're going to make a move." Darius leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders visible. "Bradley said they wouldn't stop," Darius said quietly. "Bradley also said he was a survivor," Gray replied. "But look where that got him." Darius pushed the folder aside and stood, pacing the room. "We can't let them regroup," Darius said. "If Green thinks he still has control, he's going to dig in. And if we don't act fast, we'll lose everything we've built so far." Gray crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Darius stopped pacing and turned to face him. "We push harder," Darius said. "We hit them where they're weakest, expose the connections they can't hide. But we do it smart. Quiet. Green's dangerous, but he's also arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable, just like Bradley did." Gray raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're ready for that?" Darius didn't hesitate. "I've never been more ready." Gray nodded slowly, but there was something cautious in his eyes. "Then let's make sure we don't miss," Gray said. The sound of footsteps echoed as Darius entered the holding area once again. Bradley was sitting at the same table, but he looked different this time. The defiance was gone, replaced by something more brittle. Fear. Bradley didn't look up when Darius entered, but Darius didn't give him time to stall. "You were right," Darius said, his voice cutting through the silence. Bradley's head snapped up. "What?" Darius sat down, his eyes fixed on Bradley. "Green's already moving," Darius said. "He's burning evidence, cutting ties. He knows we're coming." Bradley swallowed hard, his cuffs rattling as he shifted in his chair. "I told you," Bradley said, his voice sharp but shaky. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then help me understand," Darius shot back. Bradley leaned forward, his voice low. "They don't leave loose ends," Bradley said. "And that's what I am now, a loose end. Just like you." Darius's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Then give me something I can use," Darius said. "Help me take them down before they take us down." Bradley hesitated, his breathing shallow. "You don't get it," Bradley said, his voice breaking slightly. "Green doesn't play by the rules. He owns the rules. You think arresting me shook him? It just made him more dangerous." Darius leaned closer. "You're scared of him," Darius said. "Good. That means we're close." Bradley's eyes darted to the door, and for the first time, Darius saw him falter completely. "They'll come for me first," Bradley muttered. "They already have you," Darius countered. Bradley shook his head. "No," he said. "Not like this. Green doesn't let people talk. If I tell you what you need to know, they'll make sure I don't get the chance to say anything else." Darius's voice dropped. "They don't get to decide that," Darius said. "You do." Bradley looked at him, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, something close to desperation. "I need protection," Bradley said. "You'll get it," Darius replied. Bradley hesitated, then finally leaned in. "Green runs it all," Bradley said. "But he's not the only one calling the shots. There's someone else, someone higher up. I don't know who. Green always handled that part. But I do know this, whoever it is, they're not just protecting the operation. They're feeding it." Darius felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean, feeding it?" Bradley looked down at the table. "The arrests, the charges, it's all a pipeline," Bradley said. "Green's network isn't just about dirty cops. It's about power, money. Judges getting kickbacks, private prisons filling beds, politicians cashing in. And Green's the one who makes sure the machine keeps running. Darius leaned back, his mind spinning. And now? Darius asked. Bradley's eyes flickered. Now? Bradley said. Now he's cleaning house. The words hit like a punch. You said Green doesn't play by the rules, Darius said, his voice sharp. Then let's make sure he doesn't get to make the rules anymore. Bradley's breath hitched. You don't know what you're starting, Bradley said. No, Darius said. But I know how to finish it. Darius stood, his heart pounding as the weight of the information Bradley had just given him settled like a stone in his chest. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt cop anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system. And he wasn't going to stop until it fell apart. The dim light in the interrogation room cast sharp shadows along the walls, making the space feel even smaller than it already was. Darius leaned against the cold metal table, his knuckles pressed into its surface as he stared at Bradley. The former officer sat across from him, his shoulders hunched and his wrists still bound in cuffs. Sweat glistened at his temples, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door every few seconds as if he expected someone to barge in at any moment. You said Green's cleaning house, Darius said, his voice low but steady. What does that mean? Bradley shifted in his chair, the cuffs rattling as he looked down at his hands. It means he's not just covering his tracks, Bradley said. He's tying up loose ends, people who might talk, evidence that might get out. Whatever's left, he's burning it. Darius narrowed his eyes. Burning it how? Bradley looked up, his eyes sharp with something between fear and desperation. Literally, Bradley said. Records, reports, anything that can trace back to him. They're destroying evidence faster than you can collect it. And the people? The ones who know too much. Bradley hesitated. They're disappearing, Bradley finished. Darius's jaw tightened. And you? Darius asked. Bradley swallowed hard. I was supposed to be next, Bradley admitted. They were already circling me, making threats, watching me. I thought I could handle it. Thought I could scare them off, but I was wrong. That's why I came to you in the first place. Darius's eyes locked onto Bradley's. You didn't come to me, Darius said. You got caught. Don't rewrite history. Bradley flinched but didn't argue. Fine, Bradley muttered. But it doesn't matter how I got here. The point is, I'm here now. And if Green finds out I've been talking, he already knows, Darius interrupted. Bradley's breath hitched. What? You think Green doesn't have people on the inside? Darius said. You think this place is safe? It's not. That's why you're still in this building. If we move you before we're ready, it's over, for both of us. Bradley's face paled. So what are you saying? That I'm stuck here? I'm saying, Darius said, leaning closer, that you need to give me something useful, something I can use against Green now, because the longer we wait, the less chance we have of stopping him. Bradley hesitated, his shoulders sagging. You don't get it, Bradley said, his voice breaking. I wasn't high enough to see the whole picture. Green's smart, he doesn't let people get too close to the top. But there's one thing I know for sure. What? There's a shipment coming in, Bradley said. Something big. Green's been talking about it for weeks. He's moving money, dirty money, and using it to buy silence. Payoffs, bribes. He's tying up loose ends, just like I said. When? Tonight. Darius's pulse quickened. Where? Bradley hesitated again, his eyes flicking to the mirror on the wall. You don't need to know that, Bradley said. Because if you go after him, you won't make it out. Darius slammed his hands down on the table, making Bradley jump. Tell me where it is. Darius barked. Bradley flinched but finally spoke. "The docks," Bradley said. "Warehouse 14. Midnight." Darius stepped back, his breathing sharp. "If you're lying, I'm not," Bradley interrupted. "But you need to be careful. Green doesn't take risks unless he's sure he'll win. If he's meeting tonight, it's because he's already set the board." Darius didn't respond. Instead, he turned and knocked on the door. It opened immediately, and Gray stepped in. "Get him out of here," Darius said without looking back at Bradley. "And keep him breathing." Bradley's voice followed him out. "You don't stand a chance," Bradley called. "You'll see. He's always 3 steps ahead." Darius didn't stop walking. The docks were quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Fog hung low, swirling in the pale glow of the overhead lights, and the distant hum of a boat engine echoed across the water. Darius crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, his eyes scanning the rows of warehouses until he spotted the number, 14. Gray's voice crackled softly through the earpiece. "We're in position," Gray said. 2 teams, one on the east side, one on the west. Say the word." Darius's fingers tightened around his radio. "Wait for my signal," Darius said. He moved carefully, keeping low as he made his way closer. A black SUV was parked near the entrance, its headlights off but the faint glow of a lit cigarette visible inside. 2 men stood near the door, their silhouettes sharp against the mist. Darius could feel the tension in his chest, but he forced it down. He had one shot at this. He pressed the radio. "Go." Everything happened at once. Agents swarmed in from both sides, weapons drawn. Shouts filled the air as the men near the door scrambled, one of them reaching for a gun before being tackled to the ground. Darius moved fast, pushing through the chaos and into the warehouse. Inside, it was worse than he'd imagined. Stacks of crates lined the walls, each marked with codes he didn't recognize. Bags of cash were piled high, and in the center of it all, Patrick Green stood, calm and collected, his hands in his pockets. "You're early," Green said, his voice smooth as he turned to face Darius. "Drop it." Darius barked, his gun trained on Green. Green smirked. "Do you really think it's that simple?" Darius's finger hovered near the trigger. "It is." Green shook his head. "No," Green said. "Because if you shoot me, this doesn't stop. You know that, don't you? You can't kill an idea. And that's what this is, a system. Bigger than me. Bigger than you." Darius stepped closer. "You're done," Darius said. Green's smirk faltered, just for a second. "Am I?" Suddenly, a door burst open behind them, and more agents flooded in. Green's hands shot up, but his eyes never left Darius's. "This isn't over," Green said quietly. "It is for you," Darius replied. And as Green was dragged away, Darius finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But he knew the battle was far from finished. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with anticipation as reporters whispered to each other, cameras flashed, and a faint hum of voices filled the space. Darius sat near the front, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the defendant's table. Patrick Green sat there, wearing a tailored suit that did little to hide the tension etched across his face. For the first time, the man who once controlled everything looked like he knew it was slipping away. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "All rise." Darius stood with the others, but his eyes never left Green. This was the moment everything had led to, the lies, the cover-ups, the threats. Now it was all out in the open, and no amount of money or influence could stop what was coming. Green shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering something in his ear, but the man barely responded. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The judge spoke, her voice sharp and steady. "Mr. Patrick Green, you have been found guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to this community and undermined the trust placed in law enforcement. For these crimes, you are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison." A gasp rippled through the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. Green's shoulders sagged, but he quickly straightened, forcing himself to look calm. But Darius saw through it. He saw the panic in Green's eyes, the realization that he was no longer in control. Green turned slightly, his gaze locking onto Darius. "You think this ends with me?" Green said under his breath, his voice barely audible but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Darius didn't flinch. "No," Darius said, his voice low but firm. "But it ends for you." Green's lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but Green didn't look away until the guards escorted him out. As Green disappeared through the door, Darius let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he didn't feel relief, at least, not yet. Days later, Darius stood outside the precinct, watching as officers carried boxes of evidence out to waiting vans. The investigation had exposed more than anyone expected: judges, politicians, business owners. The network was bigger than even Bradley had realized, but now it was crumbling. Gray stepped up beside him, his hands in his pockets. "You did it," Gray said. "We did it," Darius replied. Gray smiled faintly. "You sure you don't want a break after this?" Gray asked. Darius shook his head. "There's too much work left to do," Darius said. Gray nodded. "I figured you'd say that." Darius turned to him. "What about Bradley?" Gray's smile faded. "He'll testify against the others," Gray said. "His deal holds up, but he's going away for a long time. Witness protection after that." Darius didn't respond right away. "He's still a criminal," Darius said finally. "Yeah," Gray agreed. "But even criminals can be useful." Darius looked back at the precinct as another box was carried out. "This isn't over," Darius said. "No," Gray replied. "But it's a start." Bradley sat in a small cell, staring at the wall. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping nervously. He'd traded one prison for another, but at least this one came with the promise of eventual freedom. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The guards moved past his door, their footsteps echoing down the hall, but he didn't look up. Instead, he leaned back, closing his eyes. He'd thought he was untouchable once. Now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. But one thing was certain: he'd never forget the look in Darius's eyes when he said, "It ends for you." And for the first time, Bradley believed it. Weeks later, Darius stood on the steps of the courthouse, reporters shouting questions at him as he made his way to the microphone. The sun was bright, and the crowd pressed closer, eager for answers. Darius raised his hand, and the noise quieted. "Today is a step forward," Darius began. "Not just for this department, but for this city. Corruption thrives in the shadows, but it can't survive in the light. What we've done here is more than arrest a few bad actors, we've sent a message. No one is above the law." Cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "But this is just the beginning," Darius continued. "The fight isn't over, and we can't afford to stop now. Accountability is the foundation of trust, and it's up to all of us to protect it." Darius stepped back, ignoring the shouted questions as he made his way down the steps. As the sun set, Darius sat alone in his apartment, the glow of the city lights spilling through the window. The phone on his desk buzzed, but he let it ring. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. He'd won this round. But he knew there would be others. And when they came, he'd be ready. Because that's what justice demanded. This story reminds us of the power of accountability, how one person's fight for justice can expose corruption and inspire change. It shows that standing up to those who abuse their power isn't easy, but it's necessary. So what about you? What would you have done in Darius's position? Could you have faced the pressure, the danger, and the uncertainty? Or would you have walked away? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, thought-provoking stories like this one. Hit the like button and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.